When Matthew first mentioned that his cousin was coming to stay, my mind conjured the image of a social parasite, a stunted young man with a suitcase full of tangled wires, unwashed laundry, and the lingering scent of stale energy drinks. I prepared myself for a week of polite tolerance and forced small talk. But the man who stepped through our front door that rainy Thursday evening was not the boy from the old family photo albums. Jackson arrived tall, quiet, and possessed of a stillness that was immediately unnerving. He didn't just inhabit the room, he observed it. He watched the way I moved between the kitchen and the dining table, the way my smile faltered when I thought no one was looking, and the hollow way I filled the silence whenever Matthew was away on business. There was an unsettling grace in how easily he integrated himself into our domestic rhythm, like a ghost that had lived there long before we ever moved in. I should have listened to the primal instinct that prickled the back of my neck the first time our eyes locked. By the time I realized the guest room was empty and the floorboards in the hall were groaning under his weight, the trap had already closed. I had only met Jackson once, a decade ago, at a sweltering family barbecue where he had been just another blur in the background. Back then, he was unremarkable, a lanky teenager with a shy disposition. But as he stood in our entryway with the rain shimmering on his dark coat and a suitcase gripped in a calloused hand, I realized that time had been transformative. His shoulders had broadened, his jawline had been chiseled into a sharp, unforgiving edge, and he carried a quiet confidence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "Hi, I hope I'm not too early," he said. His voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't prepared for the sudden, traitorous flutter of my pulse. Matthew, oblivious to the shift in the air, pulled him into a boisterous hug. They were cousins by blood, but had been raised like brothers until distance and different career paths had carved a chasm between them. This visit was supposed to be a bridge, a way to reclaim lost years. "Abby, why don't you show Jackson to the guest room?" Matthew suggested, already rummaging through the fridge for beers. "Of course," I replied, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "Follow me." As I led him up the stairs, I became hyper-aware of my appearance. I was wearing faded yoga pants and a t-shirt 3 sizes too large, hardly an outfit for a formal introduction. Yet, I felt when my husband, Matthew, first mentioned that his cousin was coming to stay for a while, I had already mentally braced myself for a burden. I imagined an awkward, overgrown boy with suitcases overflowing with tangled wires, video games, and the kind of unrefined habits that come from living too long in a bachelor pad. I expected to be a glorified maid for a week. Instead, the man who stepped through our front door that rainy Thursday evening was someone I didn't recognize. Jackson was tall, toweringly so, with a quiet, grounded presence that seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the hallway. He didn't just walk into our home, he inhabited it. He was exceedingly observant, his dark eyes tracing the architecture of our lives with a precision that made my skin prickle. He watched everything, the way I adjusted my hair in the hallway mirror, the hesitant curve of my smile when I greeted him, and the way the silence in the house grew heavy and expectant whenever Matthew wasn't around. There was something deeply unsettling about how seamlessly he folded himself into our daily routine, like a missing piece of a puzzle we hadn't realized was broken. I felt the warning bells in my chest from the start, a primal instinct telling me that his politeness was a mask for something far more predatory. I should have trusted that feeling the night I heard the floorboards outside my room groan under a heavy weight. I should have locked the door. But by the time I sat up and realized the guest room was empty, the air in my own bedroom had already changed. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He was already in my bed. I had only met Jackson once, nearly a decade ago, at a frantic family barbecue. Back then, he had been just another face in a sea of relatives, a blur of polite nods and unremarkable small talk. He was quiet even then, but I had written it off as shyness. When he stood on our porch in the rain, suitcase in hand and a sharp, devastatingly charming smile on his face, I realized I had been catastrophically wrong. Maybe I had never truly looked at him, or maybe time had been exceptionally kind to him. His shoulders had broadened into an athletic frame, his jawline was carved from granite, and his confidence seemed to vibrate in the air before he even spoke a word. Hi, I hope I'm not too early, he said, his voice a low, warm mahogany that resonated in my bones. I wasn't prepared for the sudden, traitorous flutter in my stomach. Matthew, ecstatic to see him, pulled him into a bone-crushing hug. They had grown up more like brothers than cousins, inseparable until life, career paths, and 1,000 miles of geography had drifted them apart. This visit was supposed to be a bridge across that gap, a time for old stories and cold beers. Abby, can you show Jackson where he'll be staying? Matthew asked, already rummaging through the fridge for drinks. Of course, I replied, my voice sounding thinner than usual. Follow me, Jackson. As I led him up the stairs, I became painfully aware of my own appearance. I was wearing faded yoga pants and a tattered, oversized t-shirt, the universal uniform of a woman who wasn't expecting to be perceived. I felt his eyes on the small of my back, a physical weight that made my heart race. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was looking away, but the ghost of a smirk lingered on his lips. The guest room was small, smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. I pointed out the fresh towels, the bathroom, and the extra blankets, trying to keep my tone professional, like a hotel concierge. No, this is perfect. Thank you for having me, Abby. His eyes caught mine and held them a beat too long. It wasn't just a look, it was an acknowledgement. In that silence, the air between us became a conductor for something electric. He noticed me not as Matthew's wife, but as a woman. Over the following days, Jackson became the perfect guest. He washed dishes before I could reach for the sponge. He shared anecdotes that had Matthew roaring with laughter, and he took our golden retriever for long walks without being prompted. Matthew was blinded by nostalgia, thrilled to have his brother back. I tried to play along, but I was living in a state of high alert. Every time Jackson entered a room, my posture corrected itself. I started wearing jewelry again, applying a fresh coat of lipstick in the morning, and choosing clothes that were just a little more deliberate. I lied to myself, claiming it was just the natural desire to look presentable for a guest. On Friday, the facade began to crack. Matthew was stuck at the office handling a crisis, leaving Jackson and me alone on the back deck. The humidity of the summer evening clung to our skin, and the air was thick with the rhythmic buzzing of cicadas. We sat in the fading light, sipping wine in a silence that felt dangerous. I forgot how peaceful it is out here, Jackson said, staring into the dark tree line. You've made a beautiful life here, Abby. You're welcome to visit more often, I said, the words tumbling out before I could censor them. He turned his head slowly, his gaze heavy and unblinking. Would Matthew like that? I let out a nervous, airy laugh. Of course. Your family. He tilted his head, his voice dropping an octave. And what about you? Would you like that? The question hung in the air like a physical barrier. I opened my mouth to offer a polite, safe response, but the words withered. There was an invisible current pulling at us, something reckless and undeniably dark. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the wood. I should check on the laundry. I'll help you, he said, rising in one fluid motion. No, stay here. Enjoy the wine, I snapped, fleeing into the house. I leaned against the washing machine in the dark utility room, my lungs burning as if I had just run a mile. This was insane. This was his cousin. This was my husband's best friend. But that night, sleep was a ghost I couldn't catch. Every time the house settled, I imagined I heard him moving. When I finally walked past the guest room to get a glass of water, the sliver of light under his door told me he was just as restless as I was. By Saturday, the tension was a living thing. Matthew, nursing a hangover from the night before, was still dead to the world. Jackson and I moved through the kitchen like two dancers who had practiced the choreography for years. When he reached past me to grab a cast-iron skillet, his hand grazed my hip. It wasn't an accident. The contact was deliberate, lingering just long enough to send a jolt through my entire system. Neither of us spoke. We just kept cooking, the smell of bacon and betrayal filling the room. Sunday evening brought the ultimate test. Matthew received a call about an emergency work trip, an overnight stay 3 hours away. Jackson's still here, Matthew said as he grabbed his laptop bag and kissed me on the cheek. He'll keep you company so you don't get lonely. Company. The word felt like a death sentence. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, the atmosphere between Jackson and me became suffocating. He offered to pour more wine, but I declined, my nerves already frayed to the breaking point. I sat on the far end of the couch, clutching a throw pillow like a shield. "You've been quiet today," he noted, sitting much closer than a guest should. "I'm just tired, Jackson. It's been a long week. Can I ask you something, Abby?" I turned to him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What?" If I weren't his cousin, if I were just a man you met at a bar or a bookstore, would you feel this pull too? I felt the air leave my lungs. He leaned in, his face inches from mine. "Because I feel it. I've felt it since the moment you opened that door in the rain. I know I shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about you." I stood up, my legs shaking so violently I had to grip the back of the sofa. "This isn't fair. You can't say those things to me. I'm married, Jackson. I love my husband." "I know you do," he said, standing up and holding his hands out as if to calm a startled animal. "And I would never want to hurt him." "Then stop. Just stop." "I will," he whispered. "I just needed to say it out loud once. Before I leave." I nodded, unable to find my voice, and practically ran up the stairs. I retreated into my bedroom, locking the door and pulling the covers up to my chin. I told myself I was safe. I told myself it was over. But then I heard it. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps in the hallway. The slow, deliberate turn of the doorknob. The lock clicked. I had forgotten that Matthew had the master key on the ledge above the frame. The door creaked open, and the dim light from the hall spilled across the carpet. Jackson stood there, a shadow against the light. He wasn't hesitant anymore. He wasn't the polite guest. "You shouldn't be in here," I said, my voice a broken whisper. "I know. Go back to your room, Jackson." "I had to see you," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him, plunging us into near total darkness. "Just one more time before I fly out tomorrow." I should have screamed. I should have threatened him. But a part of me, a dark, starved part of me that had been dormant for years, felt a sick sense of relief. "I don't know what you think this is," I said, trying to find my resolve. "You're his family." He moved toward the bed, his silhouette imposing. "I've spent every night in that guest room telling myself to stay away. I've stared at the ceiling until dawn, trying to memorize every reason why this is a mistake. But then I see you. And the reasons don't matter anymore." He knelt by the side of the bed, his face level with mine. The scent of him, rain, wood smoke, and something uniquely masculine overwhelmed me. "I'll go if you tell me to," he whispered, his breath hot on my cheek. "I just need to know. Have I imagined this? Have I imagined the way you look at me?" I looked into his eyes, searching for a reason to hate him. I wanted to find malice or cruelty or a joke. But all I found was a reflection of my own desperate, hidden hunger. I shook my head slowly. "This is a mistake," I whispered. "Then I'll go," he said, beginning to rise. I could have let him walk out. I could have saved my marriage in that 1 second of silence. Instead, I reached out and caught his wrist. "Jackson," I said. "I haven't imagined it either." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. He didn't say another word. He simply climbed into the bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. When he slipped under the covers, it felt like the most natural and the most horrific thing I had ever done. We lay there for a long time, inches apart, the air between us vibrating. Then his hand reached out, his fingertips tracing the line of my jaw with agonizing slowness. I didn't pull away. I closed my eyes and let out a jagged breath. "I've thought about this since the first night," he murmured. "What happens tomorrow?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer with words. He leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It wasn't the gentle, routine kiss of a husband. It was a starving man finally finding food. I responded with a ferocity that terrified me, kissing him back as if I were trying to erase the last 10 years of my life. The way he touched me was an exploration, a discovery. He was careful, curious, and devastatingly thorough. Every boundary I had built around my heart and my vows crumbled into dust. For those hours, Matthew didn't exist. The house didn't exist. There was only the heat of Jackson's skin and the crushing weight of a desire I could no longer control. But when it was over, the darkness felt different. It was no longer a veil, it was a mirror. "You should go," I said, my voice cold and hollow, facing the wall. He didn't argue. He dressed in the shadows, the rustle of his clothes sounding like a funeral march. The door clicked shut, and I was alone in a bed that no longer felt like mine. The next morning was a blur of high-functioning dissociation. Matthew texted that he was coming home early. I stared at the phone, my stomach churning. When I passed Jackson in the hallway, he was carrying his bags. We didn't look at each other. There were no secret smiles, no lingering touches. Just a cold, dead silence. By the time Matthew's car pulled into the driveway, Jackson was already gone, his presence erased from the house, except for the mark he had left on me. "Everything okay while I was gone?" Matthew asked, dropping his bags and pulling me into a hug. I forced a smile, my face feeling like a mask that was about to crack. "Yeah, everything's fine." But fine was a lie I would have to tell for the rest of my life. The days that followed were haunted. I went through the motions of a happy wife, but I was a ghost in my own home. Matthew would talk about Jackson, about how much better he seemed after the visit, and every word was a needle under my fingernails. I told myself it was a one-time lapse. A moment of madness. I could bury it. And then, 2 days later, the first text arrived. "Abby, I can't stop thinking about you. Call me." I deleted it instantly. I blocked the number. But the silence in my head was gone, replaced by the memory of his voice. I held out for 3 nights before I unblocked him. I told myself it was to tell him to stop, but when I finally called him from the grocery store parking lot, the words that came out were different. "I'm coming back next weekend," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You can't." Matthew. Matthew invited me. He wants to go fishing. He wants the brothers back together. I've already booked a hotel in town. I won't stay at the house. The dread was suffocating, but beneath it was a sickening spark of anticipation. When the weekend arrived, the air in the house was electric. Jackson played his part to perfection. He was the grateful cousin, the helpful guest, the man of integrity. He even brought a bottle of expensive wine for us to share. I stayed in the kitchen, keeping a physical barrier between us, but our eyes met across the room, and the silent conversation we were having was loud enough to scream. That Saturday night, Matthew and Jackson went out to a local bar. I stayed home, claiming a headache. At 11:42 p.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'm outside. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight glint off his car. I knew that if I stepped out that door, there would be no turning back. I knew I was destroying a man who loved me. I put on my shoes anyway. I met him by his car. We didn't speak. The cool night air felt like a splash of cold water, but it didn't wake me up. "This has to be the last time," I whispered. "I know," he lied. I followed him into the car, driven by a craving that felt more like an addiction than love. When he kissed me this time, it was desperate and familiar, the kind of kiss that happens when you know the end is coming. I returned home before Matthew, slipping back into bed and pretending to be asleep when he finally stumbled in, smelling of beer and tobacco. I watched him sleep, a wave of self-loathing washing over me. I was a stranger to myself. The end came not with a bang, but with a plastic card. 2 days after Jackson left for the second time, Matthew walked into the kitchen holding a white plastic hotel key card. He had found it in the pocket of the sweatshirt I had worn that night. "Hey, what's this?" he asked, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Did Jackson leave this behind? My heart didn't just skip, it stopped. I reached for it too fast, my movements jerky. Oh yeah, he must have dropped it when we were hanging out. I probably picked it up without thinking and threw it in my pocket. Matthew looked at the card, then back at me. His expression shifted from confusion to a cold, sharpening realization. "Why would you have his hotel key, Abby? He wasn't even at the house that night." I stammered. I lied. I made up a story about helping him pack, a story so flimsy it fell apart the moment it left my lips. Matthew didn't yell. He just handed me the card and walked out of the room. The silence that followed was worse than any screaming match. He began to watch me. He became distant, his eyes no longer filled with warmth, but with a calculating suspicion. The final blow landed a week later. I had left my phone on the kitchen counter while I went to the garden to pick herbs. A message flashed across the screen. Asterisk, can't stop thinking about your skin. I miss you. When I walked back inside, Matthew was standing over the phone. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. The words were right there, etched in light. Who is this? He asked, his voice deathly quiet. I froze, the bunch of basil in my hand feeling like a lead weight. Matthew, I asked you a question, he said, stepping toward me. You've been sleeping with him. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a verdict. I couldn't lie anymore. The weight of the secret had become too heavy to carry. I started to cry, but the tears didn't move him. They only seemed to disgust him. He walked out that night. He didn't come back for 3 days. The house became a tomb. I wandered through the rooms, seeing the ghosts of the life we had built and the wreckage of the one I had chosen. Jackson reached out one last time, offering a hollow apology, saying he never meant to destroy us. I didn't respond. I realized then that Jackson hadn't been the prize. He had just been the catalyst for my own self-destruction. Eventually, Matthew returned, but only to pack. He moved with a mechanical precision, ignoring my pleas, my explanations, and my apologies. I don't hate you, Abby, he said, pausing at the door with his final box. But I don't know you. And I can't live with a stranger who could do this to me with my own blood. He left, and the silence he left behind was permanent. Now, I live alone in a different city. I am rebuilding, but the foundation is shaky. I realize now that I wasn't looking for Jackson. I was looking for a way to feel alive in a life that had become too comfortable, too quiet. I made the worst possible choice to fill a void that I should have filled myself. Trust is a mirror. Once it's shattered, you can glue the pieces back together, but the cracks will always show the distortion. I carry a scar now, a reminder of a rainy Thursday and a man who was never supposed to stay. I am no longer the woman I was, but I am learning to live with the woman I became.